Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Richter, the Interim Director of Communications at the Center for Effective Altruism. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Kelsey Piper. Kelsey is a senior writer at Vox's Future Perfect, where she covers global health, science, and tech. You can submit questions throughout the session and throughout Kelsey's talk through Swapcard, and then we'll have a mix of prepared and audience questions to ask Kelsey during the Q&A session after her talk. You can also continue the discussion with Kelsey in office hours after this session in Junior Ballroom 4. So without further ado, welcome Kelsey Piper.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to EA Global of February 2025. When I was going through fact-checking this speech, I sort of lingered for a bit on February 2025. I was like, dear God, is it still February? When I was a naive young reporter, which is to say on January 15th of 2025, I told the CEA team, yeah, I'll get you slides and a practice talk by like the first week of February. And then over the next 2 weeks, the OpenAI team announced a $500 billion investment in new data centers and technology. And then Elon offered to buy the OpenAI nonprofit for $100 billion. And Sam Altman told him we're not selling, but he was selling just, to himself instead. And the US government shut down temporarily or maybe permanently some of the absolute best global health programs out there, from PEPFAR to Gavi to the President's Malaria Initiative, and passed a whole slew of other executive orders that touched on a dozen things I care about from one direction or another. And there's no slides for this talk. There was no practice talk. You are the practice talk. But I do have a lot to say about what effective altruism means in this moment, and what effective altruism has evolved to mean to me in the 10 years since I showed up at my very first EAG event. Francis said earlier, EA is about doing the most good. And that is like a very accurate definition, but I kind of want to unpack it. I think that rolled into that is a bunch of assumptions that are themselves, very much contested and that I think matter quite a lot. I sort of think of the core thesis of effective altruism as being, there is a lot of important work in the world. It is going undone, and you can do some of it. Now, all of that is just kind of implicit when we say do the most good. But I think sometimes it's worth spelling it out, because a lot of people you lose on every one of those steps, that there is a lot of important work to be done in the world, that the difference between doing things right and doing things badly is very large, is measured in millions of lives, is measured in the fate of civilizations, is measured in the lives of billions of animals. I think it's true, and I think it matters. And I think you kind of have to argue for it. You don't have buy-in even there. And then the next part is that work is going undone. This one seems straightforwardly true to me. If you try and pull up the answer to a question you care about, reasonably often one person wrote one sort of write-up of it, and that's all we're working from. But I think often until you try to dig into a question that really matters to you, it's easy to assume that more people have thought about it, that more people are working on it than really are. I think there's something very powerful about having a question that you really care about the answer to, and going and looking and realizing how shallow civilization's attention is spread across the many, many things that we're trying to do. How many important questions have a handful of people who've been talking about them or thinking about them, and how much you can do just by joining that conversation and bringing to it your own questions and the parts of it that matter the most to you. So that's what I think of as the core thesis of effective altruism. There's a lot of important work. It is going undone, and you can do some of it. You can't do all of it. There is too much of it. And that's where a lot of the classic questions and technologies and puzzles of effective altruism come in. Which of those many, many important things that are lying there undone that lives depend on, which of them are you going to pick up? And how do you figure out where your efforts are going to go the farthest? I don't feel like I have anything new to say on that. A lot of really smart people are going to be talking this weekend about specific problems that they have been working on where they think it is highly impactful to have your time and your attention. I kind of just want to start this conference with an argument for that basic shared view that there is important work. It is going undone, and all of us have the power to do it. And then I want to talk a little bit about concretely in my life what that looks like, because I think it looks a little different for everybody, but there's also some similarities I've noticed in like 10 years of doing this. In the last year, I've had sort of two occasions where I've been like, I'm so grateful for effective altruists. There are problems where when I'm trying to work on them and I want a sort of clarity and a sort of focus and a set of people who are really approaching those questions with a sincere interest in the true answer, the only place where I find those people is here. And in the last year, two sort of stories I've worked on are the OpenAI story about their non-disclosure agreements, and then a recent story trying to figure out the impacts of the stop work order on PEPFAR. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looked like in both cases. So OpenAI, for those of you unfamiliar, big tech company, they had a policy by which departing employees had to sign a non-disparagement agreement, which was itself secret. They could not acknowledge having signed a non-disparagement agreement. And if they didn't agree to sign that, they were told that they would lose access to their vested equity. This is pretty far beyond the pale in Silicon Valley, but it persisted for a long time because a lot of people didn't want to rock the boat. You know, we were talking about millions and millions of dollars. A lot of people didn't want to attract the attention of vindictive or frustrating people. A lot of people didn't want to have a reputation for being a troublemaker. You have no idea how many things happen because someone's like, I don't want to have a reputation for being a troublemaker. I strongly encourage you to think about at what point you would have a reputation for being a troublemaker. It doesn't have to be over the first unreasonable thing you see. But if you don't have in mind where you would draw that line, I think later you might end up allowing some stuff to pass that earlier you would not have been comfortable with. So that's one piece of advice. But anyway, some people decided they weren't comfortable with this, and they meticulously documented all of the things that they had been told about their obligations to the company, their emails with the company documents, their onboarding, their offboarding. And after quite a lot of thought about the effects that this would have, both good and bad, they ended up going to the press with them, at which point the company immediately folded. It was like, that was actually a complete accident. We never intended to do that. In fact, sometimes that goes really well, right? But the sort of person who will, when looking at losing millions of dollars, say, okay, but you're asking me to do something that I'm not comfortable with, so I'm not going to do it. That sort of person is very rare. It might literally just be Daniel Kokotajlo. I'm really glad that we have him. And I think that a surprising amount of society rests on the occasional willingness of people in the right place to say, nope, I'm not willing to do that. And I think that there are an unusual density of those people in this room. And I don't just think this because of Daniel Kokotajlo. I talk to a lot of people, often about situations that I'm not really going to speak about on a stage in front of hundreds of people. And I think that the effective altruist community attracts a lot of people who ask themselves the very important question, is this worth losing millions of dollars and making an enormous public stink over? And if you ask yourself that question, then when it actually is the right time for that, you're just so much more likely to notice than anyone who feels like that's a forbidden question. And if when you ask that question to your friends will give you a hug and say, I believe in your ability to do the right thing. If when you ask that question to your professional contacts will say, wow, it's bad that you're in that position and I will support you through doing the right thing here. it makes it so much easier. It still takes like a lot of virtue, but I think it lowers the bar of virtue from like insanely high to like, something that many of us could sort of stumblingly haul our way over. So to me, a lot of the value proposition of the EA community is that if I was asked at my job to do something unethical, and I said it to my friends, they would say, well, Kelsey, you're going to do the right thing, right? It's going to be stressful. It's going to be difficult. Maybe you're going to have a hard time paying rent, and we'll help you. We'll figure that out. But you're going to do the right thing, right? And if but many of you are here to do mostly professional networking. But personally, part of what I try and get out of EA Globals is immersing myself in a social environment that's a little bit different than the one I get at work, or certainly than the one I get on Twitter. And part of what I hope that you're able to find in the social and professional community around EA is people who will just say, you'll do the right thing, right? And I think there are a lot of those people here. And I think that that is sometimes of utterly incalculable value. The other time in my life in the last year when I was really grateful for effective altruism is just a couple of weeks ago when we were trying to figure out the effects of the government's stop work order on PEPFAR, which does HIV medications to about 20 million people worldwide. So naively, HIV medications save lives. If you cut off 20 million people's HIV medications, 20 million people die, right? But it's actually much more complicated than that, as I'm sure everybody who has ever read a GiveWell report on anything goes. Like how much of that funding gets taken over by other organizations? How many of those people actually go off their medications entirely? What was their compliance rate on their medications in the first place? Like, let's compare their on medication mortality to their off medication mortality. This is not like groundbreaking work. I'm not actually myself a development economist, but I was able to follow along while they were doing it. But so many programs got canceled and shattered at once that there just wasn't enough attention to do that work for all of those programs, to just answer the question for our government, where is this killing the most people and what can we do instead? So I asked a bunch of friends if we could get together in a Discord server and do it for PEPFAR, right? Just sit down, look through all of the published research and determine how many people are going to die because of this and how many people has PEPFAR actually saved over the last 20 years when you take into account some of these counterfactuals. We bothered GiveWell for some of their old marginal impact of HIV medication research. We bothered a truly astonishing number of external reviewers. If some of you are in the room, thank you so much for making sure we weren't publishing nonsense. And we just tried to figure this out. And I have interacted with a lot of advocacy, right? And almost always, the thing that's going on behind the scenes is that people are trying to prove that their program is good. They're doing this with the best of intentions. They really want their program to not be canceled. They know it's good. They've seen it do good. It matters to them. So they're trying to look at all the data and marshal the strongest argument, as a lawyer, for their program. The problem, especially if 100 programs all got canceled at once, but really the problem regardless, is that this doesn't actually help policymakers at all to figure out which of the many, many programs are really important. If we're just throwing out numbers, programs that really save millions of lives are barely advantaged at throwing out numbers compared to the programs that don't really save millions of lives. So if you actually want the best stuff to get restarted, if you actually want Congress to even know what the best stuff is, you cannot be willing to stretch the truth even a little bit when you're making the case for the program. You have to be willing to say, oh, this is actually less cost effective than I thought. Oh, actually, it looks like there is more, fraud or misuse or whatever than I thought. Oh, I think that the way we were calculating this was pretty bad. And there aren't a lot of places where I know how to find a ton of people who will spend their weekend digging into the track record of PEPFAR and also honestly say, this program isn't that great, if the program isn't that great. There's really kind of one place. It's here. It is the effective altruist community. I didn't advertise this in the effective altruist community per se, but it's not a coincidence who showed up, right? It's a very specific ethos. So I said earlier that I think the thesis of effective altruism is there is important work, it is going undone, and you can do some of it. But I don't think of that as the value proposition of effective altruism. I don't think that the EA movement is about spreading that claim per se. say. If it was, we could put that claim on some billboards and then be done, right? I think of the core value proposition of the effective altruist movement as being that around that claim, a bunch of people have accrued who care deeply about getting the right answer, about picking up the most important problems. A bunch of people who are willing, even when it is very difficult, to make sacrifices to do the right thing, to say this isn't as good as I thought, even if they still think it's good and other people are going to interpret that the wrong way. I think that is the value proposition. That is a precious thing. It is a rare thing. It exists here. It doesn't exist perfectly consistently here, but it exists at all here. And it mostly doesn't exist in many of the other places, even where people are trying really hard to do the right thing. So if people ask me, and they sometimes do, what's the future of the effective altruist movement? I'm like, man, I've tried to forecast the future of things that are like way more concrete than the effective altruist movement. And you know, my track record isn't horribly embarrassing, but it's not very good. Like don't ask me future forecasting questions. But if they ask me, like, does the effective altruist movement still matter? Is it still doing deeply important work? Is there something happening here that is not happening anywhere else that needs to happen and that makes the world a better place? That I believe, like, wholeheartedly and uncomplicatedly. And so that thesis and that value proposition, I am very willing to go to bat for, and I am very honored to be a part of. And what I'm doing here this weekend is trying to help have those conversations that are really about getting the right answer across a really wide range of very confusing and difficult topics. One final thing I wanted to say, and that is that EA has always been this, some say unholy, conjunction of a bunch of very different problems. Right? There's not a lot of similarities between OpenAI governance and PEPFAR, except that for some reason, some of the same people come to those questions. There's not a lot of similarities between worrying about factory farming and worrying about cash transfers, except that, you know, a bunch of us are trying to figure out which of those talks are going to make it to and whether we can make it to both of them, because we care about both of those things. But I think that we just talked about how the core value proposition of EA is an ability to try and get to the truth on hard questions and admit when you don't like the answer you're getting. Because if you don't do that, you will be unable to stack things sort of appropriately in prioritization. And I think that there being a wide range of problems that draw on a wide range of skills, that have a wide range of different feedback loops, that require answering in a wide range of ways, is actually healthy and kind of necessary to that kind of community. You need some problems that have a pretty quick feedback loop and it becomes immediately apparent if the thing you tried worked. The only way to get better at doing stuff is by doing stuff, and ideally by doing stuff where you can see how well it's working. And so it makes sense to me to have in one place things that are at very different points on the to-do list of humanity, things that we all care about and all want to see done, but might prioritize very differently. Because I think there are genuine synergies between solving more concrete problems, especially in the political realm. I think trying to get a law passed about gestation crates, and trying to get a law passed about AI, and trying to convince Congress to unfreeze US aid, all of these are in fact very similar skills, and it is enormously advantageous that a bunch of people care about a bunch of them. It's tough when there's a ton happening at the same time and we have to pick one. It's very tough. But I don't think it makes sense, as some past EA Globals have done, to try and segregate out the different parts of what we're doing. Firstly, because most of us, care about all of them. And secondly, because I think the process of working on some of them teaches the skills and builds the norms and builds the community that can effectively work on some of the other ones. So that's sort of my strongest defense of the EA community. When I'm trying to do really important stuff, the people here are invaluable assets in doing it. There is a lot to do. We can't do all of it, but we can do some of it. And I think that this is the best place I know to figure out what we can do and what of the stuff we can do we should be doing. So thank you all so much. Welcome to EA Global 2025. I think the plan now is for Emma to come up and ask questions via the Swap Card app. Because my last couple weeks have been busy, I ignored you all on SwapCard. It's not that your program is bad or anything. Just been busy. But I do have office hours after this as well, if you want to talk with me more about whatever you're doing.
All right. Well, first, thanks, Kelsey. Great. Yeah, I would just give a +1 to what Kelsey just said. Please submit your questions into SwapCard, and I'll be going through them as we go. But to kick us off, I am curious, as a journalist, how you think about this question of being a troublemaker and how you balance that with, traditionally the idea with journalism, right, is that you have to be very objective. And how do you balance that that norm and that sense of objectivity with also having opinions about what matters and how you approach which topics you cover? And what are maybe some examples of when you feel like, yeah, I've done a little bit of good troublemaking?
Yeah, so how journalists should relate to objectivity is obviously something that journalists have tussled over a fair bit over the last couple decades. I think there used to be a very, we're always straight down the middle, not benefiting any coalition, telling both sides was a view. And then some people were like, okay, but sometimes there aren't both sides, right? You are inherently making judgment calls about who you're calling up to represent each side, and in fact, whether you're thinking of there as being two sides to call up. And then I think that sometimes got taken as an excuse to just write things that actively misled the audience, that would lead them to a less accurate view of the world, and say, well, I'm just not giving in to both sidesism. So I've sort of seen that entire trajectory. And I think the best you can do is tell people where you're coming from. Tell them, this is how I see the world, and I am trying to sort of explain why I see it that way. If there is uncertainty among an expert community that you take seriously, definitely don't present it as a solved question. All of my AI reporting is about half of experts think this might kill us. The other half think it might not. It almost certainly won't kill us. So, take that as you will. And I think it would be bad behavior to, just because I'm personally on the might kill us side, only make that case and not recognize that there are people on the other side. But I also think that, it's not necessarily your job to just say, well, these people say this and these people say this. You can say, here's the range of views, and within that range of views, here's what I find persuasive. And I think you're doing that no matter what, so it's better to do it sort of more transparently.
That makes sense. Another journalism-related question from the audience: how do you think of the impact of EA-aligned relevant journalism? And given how competitive the industry is, should we encourage more EAs to pursue this path?
Whenever anyone asks me, I want to be a journalist, I'm like, well, you should know that we're all going to be automated in 1 to 5 years. This isn't even because I have short timelines. This is just looking at the economics of the industry. I think that journalists do a lot. I think that we do live in an era where it really matters who is tracking things down, talking about them. I think you have a sort of unprecedented degree right now of ability to shape the national conversation by going a little deeper than anybody else is and turning up facts about the world and sort of injecting them into the larger conversation. I also think it's very precarious in terms of where are you getting a job? What are you doing to make money? So I don't think it's a good, if you're looking for a nice stable career you're going to spend the next couple decades on, not happening. But I think that the instability of our times is in some ways an argument for doing this work, because it means that you can get quite large changes just out of the right conversations happening at the right time, surfacing the right details that no one else was paying attention to. There are a bunch of laws, executive orders, that have recently been passed that are basically just a guy found some regulatory rule that he took issue with, wrote a blog post and was like, this is a bad rule and we should have an executive order overturning it. And that happened. And I think that is something that will happen when the next president is in office too. I think there is a lot of power right now in just having a very specific remedy that someone can do and making the case for it and letting that sort of percolate.
Yeah. Another communication-related question, and you talked about, how we communicate about EA and the value proposition. And I'm curious, especially as somebody that works on communication in EA, do you feel like there's untapped value in how we're communicating about EA and how we're communicating that value proposition? And maybe what are we getting wrong in our approach to how we communicate with other audiences that you encounter in your work? Maybe that's in DC, maybe that's across the political spectrum. Are there things that we're getting wrong or like untapped value there?
I think I've kind of increasingly felt like trying to communicate about EA doesn't work very well. I don't have, some proposal for what we should be doing instead. But I feel like when people see work that is the product, I know, of an EA worldview doing research, they're often really impressed by it. They're like, this is solid, this is careful, this is well considered, this is the best answer to a question that I had. I think when people run across EA work organically, like they become curious about the answer to a question and they look who answered that question and it's us, you tend to get a very positive response. They're like, this is some like in-depth, serious, mature, thoughtful work. I think when people tend to run across like, the community of people with a bunch of extreme philosophical commitments who want to change the world, they're like, well, that seems pretty suspect. I don't really trust that. I don't have any reason to believe that they're doing a good job. And, that seems pretty fair to me. Like, I don't think that most people owe you enough time for you to make your full long version of your case. And I think the elevator pitch does kind of boil down to like, we figured out how to make the world better, and you should check it out. So I don't know how to do that from a comms perspective, but when someone says, I'm trying to answer this complicated question and then write about the answer I found to this complicated question, I'm like, yes, fantastic. When someone's like, I'm trying to promote EA worldviews and stuff, I'm like, I have a bunch of complicated philosophical, not even quite objections, but like,
guarantees or
so I just gave a pretty strong defense of EA existing as a community and a culture because I think it's really important. But in terms of like communicating about it, I think at this point I basically only communicate about it for accuracy's sake. Like, yeah, the EA community sure does exist and I'm part of it, and it would be kind of dishonest to like downplay that or imply otherwise. But I'm not really making the case for it except by referring you to a bunch of stuff that came out of it that I think is really good.
Okay. Something to talk more about sometime.
Yeah.
A more broad version of the question that I asked in terms of mistakes made that's very upvoted is, what in your view is EA doing wrong?
Oh man. Okay.
An easy question.
I should have had an answer to that one prepared. I think that EA a couple years ago was attracting a ton of like very ambitious people who took it really, really seriously and who we didn't super have a plan for beyond like, be agentic and come up with a plan. And I think that even at the time I was saying like, try getting a job where you have to do something difficult and just getting better at doing difficult things, because I think that transfers better than like, work at an EA org that's kind of sloppy or a mess or poorly run or whatever. In general, I think competence is quite transferable, very important, and is best built in well-run, competent organizations. I feel way more excited about encouraging people to do hard things in any organization that is competent and well-run than to like join the movement. I think we've sort of, just because there's less money, moved a little bit away from that model anyway. And like by necessity, people are sort of dispersed and finding other sources for their things. But I think to the extent that people are sort of told, yeah, getting EA funding or an EA job is the sign that you are on track to contribute in an EA way, that is what you're here to do. I kind of
don't like that compared to saying like, get really good at something. Often the place where you can get really good at something is in the private sector or in an unrelated organization, both because we do not hold all of the expertise in the world. We hold a tiny, tiny sliver of all the expertise in the world. And also because like a lot of the problems that need working on, someone will pay you to work on for other reasons, and that's great. You should go for that. So I guess like continued movement in that direction feels good to me. And then part of that is like, I think a lot of why people want to work at an EA org or get EA funding, a lot of why they treat that as validation of their EA-ness is that it makes it easier for them in the EA community. Like they feel like, probably correctly feel like they'll be taken more seriously, they'll have an easier time getting invited to things. And so we can sort of consciously produce a different culture by saying like, if you're doing something well, even if it's not something in our lists, even if you're not doing it with EA funding, especially if you're not doing it with EA funding, especially if you're not doing it for an EA org, like you get into EA Global, you get invited to these events, things like that. I think that sort of helps, we're not just reprimanding people to try and find other stuff. We're also like making it clear that being part of that value proposition and that culture is totally compatible with, doing that other stuff. Or whatever.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. If there's many different ways to be involved in EA, there's a range. Related to this question of, how we're engaging people and encouraging them to engage with EA, someone asked a question about feeling like the EA movement hasn't grown as quickly as we would have expected, given how important the problems are and how sound the thought frameworks we use are. So the question is, what are your thoughts about the growth of the EA movement? And do you agree that it could have grown faster? All ads should grow faster. And if so, what do you think we could do differently to help EA grow?
So I think some of this depends on what you see EA as being for. If it's, supposed to be a mass movement that is able to pressure like legislators and policymakers by virtue of being like huge, then obviously you want millions of people. I think if you're thinking of it as more a kind of a research community, like with a pretty broad remit for a research community, but basically as being about trying to get good answers to a bunch of these questions and then make those good answers available to people who can act on them, then it seems fine to me for it to be smaller, and maybe for there to be lots of people who are, willing to make a bunch of phone calls when PEPFAR gets canceled, but who aren't necessarily identifying as EAs, who haven't even necessarily heard of EAs. Like, if there's lots of people who care about the effectiveness of our programs and about other people, and if they read a good write-up of why PEPFAR matters, they will jump into action on that and try and get something done, then I don't care at all if they've heard of EA. And I am not even sure it's particularly helpful to try and convince them of EA rather than to try and convince them of specific things that we think are important or good or whatever. I also, when I think about mass political movements, I have mixed feelings about them. It does seem like a way to get a lot done. It often seems like the thing you get done isn't necessarily the thing that you went into it intending to get done. I think it's quite hard to grow something rapidly and have it be about the same thing that it started out being about. I think even with religions that have a specific list of teachings and a specific list of members, the effects that they end up having when they're at scale are often very different from what's officially in the teachings or whatever. So I'm kind of if I could press a button and make way more people identify as EAs, well, okay, I wouldn't do that because mind controlling people is unethical. If I could press a button and cause a bunch of commercials to have been running over the last 10 years that in a non-manipulative way convinced a bunch of people of EA, I would do that, but I wouldn't do it based on a very strong thesis it was a good thing to do. I'd be well, yeah, we'll sort of see what comes of that. And creating those commercials or whatever isn't at the top of my to-do list.
Yeah, a related question, particularly talking about political environments and political work. somebody asks, the EA movement has historically not focused significantly on US politics versus other areas, in part due to concerns of politicization, polarization risks, I think as you're saying, risks of value drift. Do you think that there is a case, though, in the current political climate to shift towards political work? What would be your case for that, maybe?
Yeah, so I do think this. Everybody I know who works in politics, I think it can be very bad for people and can make it very easy to have this worldview that's very us versus them and that magnifies differences that can be objectively kind of small into the end all be all. At the same time, millions of people are probably going to die because of the US aid cuts, right? Maybe PEPFAR gets restarted. Maybe some of the better programs do, but also they keep saying there's waivers, and the waivers keep not concretely resulting in those clinics opening. And I don't see how you can see millions of people die because of a political decision, and not a political decision that was the result of a decade of wrangling or even a spirited debate in Congress, but that was basically the result of a couple people writing memos that I don't think they cared about that much. I don't see how you can see that and say, well, being in politics is kind of bad for us. It matters a ton. And I think we should be doing more of it because it matters a ton. And I think it probably was a big mistake over the last few years. Not that people weren't saying hey, I think a Trump presidency is really bad on EA terms. I was happy to say that. I was yeah, I think on EA terms, a Trump presidency is really bad. But they're saying that, and then there's concretely having it on the to-do list, and I think it hasn't been on the to-do list. And I do think that at this point, we should probably consider that a mistake. Most obviously if global poverty is something you're focused on, but this also seems true if you care about other areas, just less blatantly and obviously true.
Related to PEPFAR in particular, what do you think is the most effective approach right now to restore funding in USAID and PEPFAR? Are there clear donation opportunities? I think I had a broader question as well when I was listening to your talk of just, what are, maybe in this example, but just in general, what avenues would you encourage people to pursue if in the face of these challenges that, sometimes there are tractable options like donations, but sometimes maybe it doesn't feel like there are things that individuals can do. I'd be curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that political advocacy is the way to go on the PEPFAR and USAID stuff, in that there's a lot happening all the time in politics, and it's very easy for things to fall out of the newspapers or whatever. And if people keep hearing about those, and it's not something that, we had 3 days of outrage over and then forgot, if, your Congress people are still getting messages about it, if you're still talking to your friends and still writing about it and stuff, I think that makes it more likely that they will eventually try and get things straightened out. There's a PEPFAR reauthorization conversation coming up in Congress, and I think it's pretty impactful to reach out to your congressperson if you can reach them. My California senators, you go straight to voicemail at this point, and they're like, our voicemail box is full. And I'm like, really? It is 2025. Our voicemail box is full. I kind of want to vote against Adam Schiff just on these grounds. I'm sorry, you don't literally have only one job, but you don't have very many of them, and this is one. But especially if you live in a state where you have a Republican senator or congressman, and especially if they're possible to reach, I think letting them know, no, I still really care about this stuff. I'm still really invested here. And I think reaching out to people who aren't EAs, I've been doing a lot of work with faith-based organizations that care a lot about PEPFAR and things like that. I think that is a good way to sort of keep that conversation, in the news, all that.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and get to some more audience questions. What are some examples of other kinds of questions that only have shallow investigations currently, but should have deeper ones?
Oh, man. Quite seriously, almost whenever I try and answer a mildly complicated question, that's sort of where I end up. Take AI. Concretely, in customer service or whatever. That's something that employs like tens of millions of people worldwide. What does like a level 1 customer service agent actually do? Can literally all of it be done with higher reliability by AI? When did that become true? Why did that AI not instantly at that point like replace those workers, especially in contexts where they didn't have like a contract or whatever? At what pace is AI replacing those workers? And what is the lag between when AI was totally capable of it and when AI actually did it? And is this like company by company? Is there like a specific person at Amazon who said, okay, we're going to do this now? I feel like these are some questions that are very relevant if you are interested in the pace of AI-related technological change. I can find nothing published on any of this from anyone. And I could, work on that. It would probably take me a couple weeks. There are a lot of things that I could work on that would take me a couple of weeks. Similarly, we did PEPFAR, but no one has done this for the President's Malaria Initiative. No one has done this for Gavi. Honestly, the best thing from a comms perspective would be if people also did this for some USAID programs that I believe are not very cost effective. So we had a bunch of them, and some of them were for the very strong programs, and some of them were, our efforts to do democratization in, I don't want to name a specific country because that seems mean, but some of the stuff USA did wasn't working. We should have reports that say that too, in order to make it clear that this isn't just, oh yeah, whatever they're doing, we're backing it up. Those reports don't exist. I don't have the time to write them. If you do, they matter.
Yeah. Another question related to your work. When you write a piece on an important topic, do you explicitly consider whether it's targeted to specific decision makers or the general public? And how do you treat those kinds of audiences differently? Or is that maybe not how you approach your writing and you're trying not to think too hard about communicating to a certain audience?
So it's very hard to predict which stories are going to resonate with people. I've written some stories that I thought were really good and really important, and as far as I can tell, they just kind of silently disappeared into the internet. I can maybe comfort myself that the AIs are reading them. And I've also written some stories that I didn't expect to go anywhere, that really resonated and I have heard made it onto decision makers' desks or whatever. I think it matters. I think as much as you can optimize for anything, trying to get things on decision makers' desks is a very good thing to optimize for. But I think it's kind of hard to predict. And you mostly want to build a general audience that has good reason to trust you, and then say things that you think are important and say them a bunch of different ways until you land on one that resonates.
One final question just for me. I'm curious, as you were saying that maybe future forecasting, not so much your thing, but I am curious for what you would like to see for the EA community in the next year or two.
Yeah, so we're in a very chaotic time, as I kind of referenced during my talk. I find this very stressful and unpleasant, but it also seems like a time where the difference between doing a good job and not doing a good job is very large, where you can accomplish a lot by finding stuff that needs to happen and getting it done. So I would be excited about sort of a energy of quickly doing stuff that needs doing, quickly writing up, for those of us who are in journalism, the rapidly changing AI situation, quickly putting together demos and models and examples, quickly communicating about the state of the world as a consequence of decisions that get made. A lot of international EAs, I think, have a big advantage over US journalists at describing the effects that US policy has in your area, just because you aren't parachuting in, you know what's actually going on. And just writing that up clearly, accurately with documentation is really valuable. So I think being more willing to move fast and trying to find stuff that's not getting done and get it done quickly is particularly valuable in a chaotic time where there's a lot of realignments happening politically and socially and technologically and all of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. That's what we have time for. And just a reminder to join us in Junior Ballroom 4 for office hours after this. Thank you so much.